Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today we are going to talk about homelessness. And of course, it's impossible to talk about homelessness strictly from an internal psychodynamic viewpoint, although that is part of it. But of course, collective socio-economic, cultural factors also play a very big role. This is a topic that's especially near and dear to my heart because many, many years ago, the very first paper that I wrote in social work school, and it was so long ago, was on homelessness. And I think we're all aware that there's a resurgence of this. And we thought it was worth trying to take an in-depth cycle around this problem and see how we might better understand it.
Homelessness is something that both of us as social workers have really circled around long before we became analysts. And from a social work perspective, we understand that the environment pushes people in various directions, and there are all kinds of external conditions that can lead to homelessness. So before we dig into any of the psychodynamic stuff, we should probably just really respect and name the struggles that people are having in this world right now.
There are some sort of amazing and fascinating facts and history. Right now, we have about 500,000 people who are homeless in the United States. About 22% of those are chronically homeless, which means that they've been homeless for a year or intermittently. 6% are veterans. 5% or so are youth, meaning that they're under age 25. And 68% are men that are over 30 and single, alone. For children, there's quite a sizable population of young people who have been aged out of foster care or who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans. So there's our population. For causes, of course, there's unemployment or underemployment. A lot of people who lived on the brink. And then if something happens, there's a medical crisis or the car dies or any one of 1,000 things, there isn't enough of a cushion to absorb the effects of a negative event. Also, we all know that we need relationships with people who care about us, people who will take us in, people who will help. And a lot of people who are homeless don't have that or don't have enough of it. Of course, there's disability, there's illness, there's substance abuse, there are mental health problems, there's domestic violence, divorce, death of a spouse, and a whole host of causes and reasons that people lose their grip on a place to live, on basic shelter. And all these things might not be sufficient to cause homelessness if there was housing that people could afford and if there were sufficient services either to care for people who really can't go into the workforce, let's say, or help people get back on their feet. So altogether, in a very, very brief way, that's the external world picture of what can lead to homelessness. And that's on us. That's our culture. Those are the socio-economic circumstances, the environmental factors.
There's so many things that we could talk about in this really complicated crucible. One of the things that just struck me as we were reviewing this is that for most of us, when we have a home that's reasonably secure, it doesn't even occur to us that it could disappear. I think about most of us that maybe were raised in suburbia, even if there's a lot of trauma going on in the house, there's all kinds of difficulties, but so few of us imagine that the house itself will somehow slip out of our hands or disappear for one reason or another. There's a kind of tacit environmental expectation that kind of the platform that I return to is going to be there the next time I come home. And how unprepared, I suppose, that we can be, how shocked, perhaps more so, that we can be when suddenly this core expectation is slipped out of our hands.
You make such a good and powerful point that everybody has to have a place to go to. In ancient and not so ancient times, babies and children who didn't have homes died. And so for most of us, we do take some kind of shelter pretty much for granted. And it's just almost unthinkable that that could disappear.
Because it seems so unthinkable that when the conditions begin to constellate that put that at risk, I think a lot of times it's difficult for us to believe that something so foundational could be taken out of our hands for one reason or another. I think about many stories that we've encountered as social workers, but also in terms of research and even our own clients, even if we get these notices that the mortgage is overdue, or other kinds of information that begins to build up, suggesting that the home is going to be put at risk, there's still something inside of us that I guess doesn't believe it on some level. Maybe we're defending against something, but as I said, I think it has something to do with core assumptions, particularly in our culture. So often we're in a scramble. Because where I'm going is, can't imagine our parents throwing us out on the street. If we tell them that we're gay at 15, that's inconceivable. Even if we've heard about it from a YouTube video, this terrible thing happens, we don't believe that will happen to us. It seems too far from reality.
It really calls up such a profound sense of exile and orphaning and rejection that it really is hard to take in that someone would be thrown out of their home or just somehow lose it. Even if it's a single room occupancy, which are pretty scarce these days, but that you could really not have shelter because it is a primary human need. Abraham Maslow was a researcher and a psychologist who famously came up with a hierarchy of needs. And right at the base of this triangle, like a pyramid, the base of the pyramid, first we have to have the things that keep us alive, like being able to breathe and have food and water and sleep. But right after that, we have to have what he called security of body. Resources, mortality, family, property, shelter. And so it's so primary that it is astonishing and shocking to see people on the street. And when we moved to New York in 99, I was stricken by people sleeping on the sidewalk. sometimes huddled up against a building, and also on subway stairs. They have landing platforms, subway cars. People have to be able to sleep somewhere.
I had a very similar experience when I went to college for the first time and went to Washington, D.C., another major urban center. And I had actually never witnessed homelessness. I mean, I was raised on Long Island in these kind of secluded suburban areas. It was shocking. And it was an initiation into human vulnerability, the fragility of what we think of as a safety net. And it also engendered an enormous feeling of helplessness in me when I began to see the magnitude of the problem. And then as social workers, really understanding the magnitude of it and the incredible resistance and obstacles to responding to it, that much like perhaps the person on the street, it engenders a kind of despair.
Yeah. I think we defend against it because we almost have to, because especially there are so many. We were in San Francisco last summer, and it was just heartbreaking. There were places on the sidewalk where the sidewalk itself was impassable because of little tents, blankets. People had set up tiny little encampments on the sidewalk. It was shocking. But, I think one of the ways that we defend against it culturally is that there is a kind of a moral stance that we come by historically because way far back in 14th and 15th centuries, there were poor laws passed. It was against the law to be poor. If you were picked up as a vagrant, you would be sentenced to 2 years of servitude, branded with a V, and that was only for your first offense. Your second offense would earn you the death penalty. And then in the spirit of, for those times, and I say it a little sarcastically, social liberalism, in 1495, Parliament issued this law that vagrants, idle, and suspected persons shall be set in the stocks for 3 days and have none other than bread and water, and then shall be put out of town. Every beggar suitable to work shall go to basically the county where he last dwelled, and there remain on penalty, etc. And in New England, when Puritans settled, people who were poor and who were vagrant would be sent back to where they had been born, the town of their origin, because it was that person had to be that town's particular problem. And I think there may be a carryover even today that we use as a defense, that because it's so horrific to think that we could ever be in such a position, that it must be that person's responsibility or dereliction or somehow a personal fault.
I think that makes good sense. That when we are caught in a sense of overwhelm and despair, that then we begin to grasp at solutions or reasons, not because it will solve the problem, but because it allows us to not lose our own functionality, causes us to not lock up because of the feeling of horror. And yet over time, if we continue to incrementally learn, investigate, come into some kind of relationship, even to the person that we pass along every time we go to work in Manhattan, to begin to have some personal connection to it, I think that sense of overwhelm begins to soften slightly, and then we can step away from some of the defensive, judgmental attitudes. And I think this is so central to Jung's work, that there is something natural inside of us that can be thwarted, that the self naturally recognizes its resonance in other human beings. And whether it's trauma, fear, lack of education, other kinds of blocks to experience, that then we resort to defenses.
It is very hard to remain open simply to the sorrow. Lives that have been wrecked, just wrecked. And that we, the collective, our governing bodies, human service agencies and organizations haven't solved the problem. And I think that is almost unbearable as well, that we can have a homeless problem in some of the big cities. It is really severe and not solve it.
So I'm envisioning this psychic landscape in the collective and wondering about the different archetypal powers that war against each other and create increasing tension and difficulty and coming to a unified sense of solution. And I think we're witnessing that very much in the United States in many different realms. But I think as Jung was interested in the rise of the feminine archetype, he was tracking something that not only needed to happen, but he was observing happening, that there was a shift in the psychic landscape from a kind of very tight nuclear circle of survival into a broader sense of connectivity. And we see this right now with this growing concern of the earth as a kind of singular entity that we're dependent upon. And by extension, this, at the very least, concern and curiosity for fellow human beings, this feeling that I think comes from the archetype of the Great Mother, that we are all brethren, that all of life, in a sense, is a child that requires some amount of attention and resource and the impulse to nurture and protect. So I think that value is, there's a drumbeat. There always has been a drumbeat, I think. Back in the 1600s, it often fell to the churches to organize some form of support system for orphans, for widows, for people that had become disabled, that there was a call for a sentiment of charitability. And then this other kind of energy, which speaks to this survival of the fittest, which we could also assign to nature. And we hear this in political realms and in various debates as they go back and forth, that each person has to compete in the great jungle of life and find the libido, find the dynamism, find the capacity to contend for resources, and the more vital wind up with more resources, the less vital and capable wind up having things slip away. And these are archetypal dynamics.
Well, I could also take it down to taking what you've said is at the level of the game of musical chairs.
Oh, interesting.
I remember going to a birthday party where this was played, and I was so anxious. The music played, and everybody, it was supposed to be fun. Everybody scrambles around, and the adults take away one chair, and then another, and then another. Well, guess who won the game of musical chairs? Absolutely the survival of the fittest. A couple of the kids, the boys, and they were, more assertive and more aggressive and had more exposure to rough and tumble, or whatever you want to attribute causality to. But a survival of the fittest is a bit like musical chairs, when we have a resource called housing that is limited, in a sense, to make the analogy, the quote, little kids, the people that have less personal resources, external world resources, relational resources, etc., are going to wind up not having shelter.
This reminds me of a topic we've talked about before in terms of Jung's perspective on the moral presence of humanity in an amoral universe. That nature isn't sentimental in any particular way, that there is this fierce competition, that animals consume each other, the weak pass away, mothers abandon children that are pups, cubs that are unwell, and that there is that idea of nature red in tooth and claw, this ruthlessness of the natural world. We try to protect ourselves from that by sentimentalizing aspects of nature, which again is perfectly understandable. But for any of us that have spent time in a wilderness, it's a serious business. And nature is not particularly sentimental in any way. With the evolution of human consciousness comes the rise of ethics and morality, and also, I think rather remarkably, the capacity for empathy to extend beyond one's own progeny.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an invention of humanity.
Yes. That is one of the things that really makes us human. It is the capacity for consciousness and a sense of obligation and relationship, eros, for our fellow man. That's why we are not, or we would like to think we're not, nature red in tooth and claw. And I remember reading way back when in social work classes, where there is very definitely a moralistic stance, and I cop to that, but that the measure of any society was how it cared for its incapacitated, its weak, its ill, its vulnerable people. Because if we don't, aren't we kind of like nature, uncaring, unfeeling, amoral?
Quite so. And Jung even speculated that we are a unique invention of the universe as human beings. As he matured in his understanding and also continued to have some extraordinary experiences, he also came to believe that the human experience is in communication with the collective unconscious, that even the great amoral nature itself is listening to the human experience, and that other patterns are emerging in the collective that may have either been latent or perhaps didn't even exist, that nature hadn't evolved some of the compassionate responses that human beings are capable of, or the enormous technological brilliance that human beings have been able to and continue to be able to generate, that something new is constellating, and that perhaps over time, that those civilized patterns will begin to become an a priori heritage to future generations as humanity continues to evolve. And so, in a certain way, we're learning about civilization, and we're learning about suffering and the mitigation of suffering at that collective level. And of course, what we see is it's been a difficult journey, and we're still really struggling to figure all this out.
It is one of the gifts of consciousness to be able to look at something and realize that it's not fair. Fairness is a wonderfully human concept, although it also extends to chimpanzees. But it really goes to show how deeply rooted it is. I think when zookeepers have done experiments, even with chimps, and there's some task that they are set, let's say it's pushing a lever when a light blinks on and off. And if some of them were rewarded with celery and others were rewarded with little pieces of banana, you could see the expressions on the faces of those who got celery. It was just sort of like, hey, whoa, wait a minute. What's up with that? He pushed the lever, I pushed the lever. How come he gets banana and I'm stuck with celery? They've done the same thing with babies, where even babies that are a year old, you could see their little brows furrow of like, something doesn't add up right. I don't get it. So it's that we have a deeply ingrained, maybe mammalian consciousness, but certainly elevated in humans of what is really right, what's fair, and is it right? Is it fair that some people, to go back to our topic for today, are out on the street and don't even have a room to call their own?
So I think all of the ways that we who are housed can imagine ourselves into circumstances that we have not personally suffered can help us mobilize, can help us invest in responding to all kinds of suffering. What I'd like to do is, since we have been talking about society, the shape of a society and a civilization, a little bit about the collective dynamics, I want to spend a little bit of time kind of honing in on the personal psyche, because homelessness is a manifestation. It's a particular phenomena, but many, many things can feed into one particular expression of a problem. So whether we have a particular illness, many, many factors can contribute to a particular illness, whether it's a social ill or an illness of the body. So I wanted to just toss around some kind of psychodynamic ideas about it. So I'm lifting up from the physical house and thinking about it as a symbolic structure. All of the things that we are tending in the physical world are also inner objects, symbolic objects. And there is some kind of a resonance between how we orient to inner objects and how we orient to their outer world correlates. So I'm thinking about the house not as a physical structure, but a representation of stability, security, self-identity, for some people, personal achievement, and that if one is consistently unable to maintain housing, is there something interfering with one's ability to be in relationship to these inner factors as well? One thing that I'm curious about is how we can suffer from repressed and dissociated memories and traumas that then show up in the relationship to the house. In the same way that we might have very painful experiences growing up, and then it shows up in the workplace, and we wind up constantly being in conflict with our boss or our coworkers because we had very painful experiences with our dad, perhaps, or our siblings. And we don't realize that it's actually manifesting from a deeper dis-ease, although the playing field shows up in the relationship to the physical house, or the playing field shows up in the employment situation. So we have very powerful emotions and memories that are associated with the concepts of home and family and security. And if we have tremendous conflicts around that, we can find ourselves disregarding ways to maintain our housing, that we're in this symbolic war, and then it shows up as an outer war. So I thought I would tell just one story about this, which is sad. I mean, very sad. I was working with a middle-aged fellow many years ago, and he was somewhat estranged from his family and was feeling particularly helpless about a situation that he was observing with his mom. So the short story is that his mom and dad had a really volatile, very, very contentious relationship. Finally, when the kids went off to college, the two of them kind of fled from each other. On one level, that seemed like something that really needed to happen, and nobody would argue with that. But for some reason, they would not tolerate actually getting a legal divorce. And his understanding of that, or at least what the parents understood, is they were raised in a very formal, old school Catholic environment. And even though this was, I suppose, in the 80s, there was a feeling that they could not bring themselves to legally divorce. It somehow seemed to violate something inside of them. And so they simply remained estranged, and in some sense happily estranged, for decades. What this fellow began to observe is that for his mom, who stayed in the family home, that the house became a symbol for the despised spouse, the despised husband.
Mm-hmm.
And because the husband legally still owned half of the house, she began to feel that anything she did on behalf of maintaining the home was an act of submission to the despised partner, that she was colluding with this terrible situation she didn't want to be in. And so her antagonistic feeling about the marriage became this war with the house. And over decades, the mom refused to repair a roof. And so all of a sudden, water is coming into the attic, refused to have pipes fixed, so that she needed a neighbor to bring a hose over so that she had access to water. She began to abandon various rooms in the house as they fell into terrible mildewing, moldering circumstances, so that over time, the only room that she would care for was her bedroom, which was the room that she had gutted and redesigned after the separation, so she felt that it really was hers, and the contents were worth tending. And then finally, after 25 years of this collapsing system, she was really forced out of the house. And she was a very strong-willed person and a fairly bright person. This isn't somebody who had an obvious disability, that was more than capable of doing any number of work. She had worked as an accountant. So it speaks to the way that we can unconsciously interfere with our ability to keep our hands on the housing, because the housing starts becoming a proxy for something else that we're really ambivalent about.
That's a really powerful story, and makes me think of Grey Gardens.
Oh, yes.
Where the mother and a daughter lived in some wonderful old estate out in a beautiful town in Long Island. And it slowly went to rack and ruin. Jacqueline Onassis and her sister were related to them. I think the older woman was her aunt or something like that. and they were incapable of caring for the home. So they're powerful stories of what looks like self-sabotage, even though the home is symbolically, something else, as you said, a symbolic war, or an outpicturing of some other mental health delusion or something gone terribly, terribly wrong. And I think there are lots of people, too, who engage in a kind of magical thinking. And we all do it in some ways at some times of, I'll just wait and see if it kind of changes or fixes itself. That people lose a job and the hope is I'll get another one quickly and get behind on the rent and eventually are evicted or don't maintain a home and health services come in.
When you were talking about Grey Gardens, and I'm also thinking about the other things you'd mentioned around magical thinking, I think we're in this place of regression. Because when I remember the first time I'd seen Grey Gardens, and then the dramatization of it with Drew Barrymore and the whole cast, that this mother and her daughter both maintain this tremendous childlike quality, that when the father had left the family, that the two of them remained in a kind of encapsulated state. Again, there was a strange kind of sweetness to each other. It had a bit of a Hansel and Gretel kind of feeling in the forest, even as animals were moving into the house, as terrible circumstances continued. And under severe stress, even a major life change, let alone trauma, we are all, as human beings, capable of tumbling back into a kind of childlike dependency, confusion. There are things that we might even have at one time been able to handle efficiently, and under a certain amount of stress, we can't even quite remember what the procedure was to do something that we used to do easily.
Yeah.
And that is enormously costly.
I think that may play into a lot of the homeless population, as it did with these, the mother and daughter, is that there is something appalling about seeing two adults in, as you say, a deeply regressed state that is infantilized, that they can't get a grip, they can't see what needs to be done, they can't sort of deal with life in any kind of a realistic way, and it's deeply frightening. As are, I think, the homeless mentally ill. They are deeply frightening with their incapacity to care for themselves. And it scares us. It's very frightening. And I know from having lived in New York from almost 20 years in the 2000s, some of the people in subways, on subway platforms, on the streets, set off an alarm bell in passersby. It's such a regressed state that I think it really strikes deep in our psyches as truly horrific. And then that feeds into this polarization. They're good, they're bad, they deserve care, no, they should get a grip and be more responsible. And I think I'm veering into another topic here that's been in the news of on the New York subway, a man named Jordan Neely was put in a chokehold by another man, an ex-Marine named Daniel Penny. And this man, Jordan Neely, I read that he was on a watch list for years of homeless people at risk. He was charged with assault at least 4 times. So this is not an amiable, essentially friendly sort of person. And he was being obstreperous on the subway car. When he got on the car, he began screaming and threw his jacket down. And this Daniel Penny, the ex-Marine, put him in a chokehold, and it resulted in Neely's death. But what's happened since then is a huge polarization of whose side are you on, with Neely being portrayed as, a helpless and mentally ill person. And then on the other hand, Daniel Penny being portrayed as the guy that stepped up, took action, and did something to protect his fellow passengers. And that's part of the problem, is we polarize. The homeless person is right or wrong or needs care, good, bad. Is Penny a hero, or, he's been charged with manslaughter? But how do we get beyond this polarization? It's deeply instilled in us to do either or, cause and effect, one or the other, make a decision. And what we now need to do, I believe, is to see this more holistically. From a Jungian point of view, we would call it the transcendent function.
Mm-hmm.
That when an individual is in conflict about, should I stay or should I go, let's say, to make it simplistic, that what we want is for some third thing to arise via a symbol that is different. It may not be entirely rational, but it's real. Sometimes people have a dream with something like this in it, or famously see the light. And I wonder if part of that could simply be a sense of compassion toward fellow humans who can be in dire straits, but they are part of our human community. Like you were talking about before, Joseph, we have more of a connection with the earth and what's happening with Mother Earth. And what about these parts of ourselves that are out there too?
I was thinking about that, and it evokes the archetype of the stranger. That if our experience is limited, experience of ourselves, experience of psyche, experience of the varieties of human states of consciousness, that it can turn people that might not be dangerous to us into strangers that feel dangerous, and that our own sense of alarm can escalate to a point where we're treating something as if it is lethal, doesn't actually require that exaggerated response. And I don't know enough about this poor fellow that was assaulted, but I'm imagining that he's dealing with a psychiatric problem.
Yes.
And we were talking about schizophrenics who find themselves without housing and on the streets. That when somebody is submerged in the unconscious, there is a profoundly unpredictable quality. And when we're around something that feels profoundly unpredictable, we certainly pay attention to it, but we can feel that we're in danger, because much of the prosocial signaling that humans do is about predictable responses. You put out your hand, somebody shakes it. You're piling around on the subway, people don't stare at each other excessively. They move purposefully. They keep their hands to themselves. I mean, there are these kind of recognized patterns in a given culture which signal that we have a sameness, a familiarity, and a mutual agreement around what we think of as acceptable behavior. When we see another adult, particularly if they're substantially physically powerful, and then they begin to behave very, very unpredictably, if we don't have a sophisticated understanding of psyche, or even our own unpredictable nature, terrible consequences for misinterpreting what's happening.
Yeah. Well, it seems that what happens a lot of the time is that a personal problem of mental illness is seen as, and understandably so, a problem of social disorder, social dysregulation, lawlessness. Because just as you said, subway car behavior is sort of keep your eyes down, keep your hands to yourself. There are all these unspoken codes for how to respect one another and contain yourself. So somebody like this man comes onto a subway car, and it's not all that unusual. And it's seen as lawlessness. It's seen as a social problem, which it also is. And that evokes an aggressive and fearful response. When we're afraid, we often strike out to hit someone. And these are often people that are not particularly well groomed. And so it escalates, sadly.
Very sadly. Another dimension that I'm imposing on that story, I do not know this to be true, of course, is that we can become over-identified with an archetypal structure. And when I imagine this fellow's connection to the military, that many military folks, in a very positive way, identify with the archetype of the hero. That they're warriors sometimes, but they're warriors in service to protecting, to be able to launch out with a sense of mission and determination. And that really comes from the archetypal level.
Mm-hmm.
The danger with any archetype is that it enhances certain ways of thinking, acting, and believing and feeling, and it inhibits other qualities, for instance, vulnerability or empathy. So I could also imagine if this fellow, in his own struggle for ego strength, is launching forward because he feels heroic. This looks like something dangerous. The people are here around him. He's lost his way in the archetype of the hero and is launching in this really frightening and life-threatening way. But in the inner world, is he telling himself some kind of a mythic story which doesn't line up with reality, which is often the case when people are trapped in mythic narratives?
Mm-hmm.
They're interesting. I understand. Jungian study them, but they're not adequate blueprints as a way of guiding our physical behavior. And they're psychological analogs. And I wonder in a number of these tragic situations where people rise up and act out towards someone they think is threatening, how much of that is a possession by this heroic archetype? And I think part of that is evidenced because they're often surprised at the consequences. That many of these killers thought that people would think they were heroic.
Yeah.
And that's as it always is when the archetype begins to fade out. And then we realize we're subject to the laws of the country. We're subject to being imprisoned. We're subject to being retaliated against for immoral actions. The humanity is restored and people feel shocked. And I think this goes to the need for a general psychological initiation, which is so much of what we do on the podcast, so much of what Jung was trying to do with his extensive writings, with this introduction of deeper layers of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we want our lives to be better, happier. We want to solve our problems, but they also protect us from certain psychological events that would be terrible for us to be caught in.
Yeah.
And Jung wrote equally about that, especially when he was writing about World War II, these terrible kinds of what he called psychic infections and these archetypal activations. He wasn't seeing anything good happening around these things.
Yeah.
And he felt that if people knew more, that they wouldn't succumb to them.
Yeah. I want to go back, especially based on what you just said, to where something new might arise. And, as much as we could say, and I think I did say something like compassion, but I'm thinking now along more archetypal lines, and that perhaps what is really needed is the archetype of containment. So we're right back to the home that contains us, and certainly sort of the mother archetype. There was the mother church that took in orphans and gave aid to widows, etc. But I'm really thinking much more concretely, literally, about containment. And could this man on the subway, Jordan Neely, have simply been contained? He was a small man, not a big and burly guy. Can we contain the homeless people that are out there on the streets by giving them, guess what, housing? Can we contain our mentally ill population and say, you will need to be in some kind of a system, perhaps with physical boundaries where you can be safely contained and others can be protected from acting out of inner chaos?
This is a powerful conversation in the culture, as you well know, as social workers. This war between individual freedom, individual responsibility, and actually intervening in situations where people are not mentally competent.
Right. But it marries, or I'm hoping that it marries, you tell me what you think, but it marries the external world, concrete problem of housing and all kinds of other needs that we mentioned earlier, with some of the internal problem, whether it's the mother-daughter at Grey Gardens, where they could not contain the very home that was supposed to contain them, or people who act out, who have, all kinds of physical and mental health conditions, et cetera, et cetera. But there's an inner containment and outer containment that is, at least to me, a possibility as an archetypal framework for this.
What I'd love to do is for us to unpack that, because I think when people hear the word containment, they're hearing things like imprisonment.
Oh, okay.
Because we understand that as a psychological term, which is much more nuanced than that. Containment often arises as a very important regulating psychological function that comes from early childhood. And we know this from the advances, we know more about it from the advances in trauma treatment and nervous system and brain development, so that when the primary caregiver, which is generally the mom, is close to the infant, the attention that the caregiver provides to the infant, even something like beneficent eye contact, actually helps the infant's nervous system in a sense, wrap some warm hands around their distress and soothe things to bring them down to a manageable level. And years of this kind of assistance at understanding what we're experiencing, somebody companioning us, somebody naming what we're feeling, all of the things that primary parents do, primary caregivers do, actually change the way the brain functions. And if, for whatever reason, that kind of self-regulating process has been interfered with, which might be biological, as schizophrenia is, or it might be circumstantial, like early childhood trauma, then the question is, how is this self-regulation going to be engaged? Much of this is addressed in psychoanalysis and general psychotherapy, for that matter. This idea of warm, beneficent understanding, calmness, listening. That's a form of containing. And depending on the volatility of somebody and their inability to neurologically self-contain, and this is where I think you were going, Deb, do we need, out of compassion, to become more involved?
Yes. The containing also is boundaries, which is why infants sometimes are very, very calmed by being swaddled and tightly contained, in a well-wrapped blanket. We encourage kids as they develop to contain themselves. We say to little kids, don't hit, use your words. I get it. You're really upset. Use your words. And we help them with that. So there's a firmness and some boundaries where, we don't allow certain behaviors for our kids. We say no. If the 6-year-old wants to have ice cream for dinner, and we say no, and have some for dessert. So it's not just sort of cotton batting, warm and fuzzy cocooning. It also provides the boundaries within which people can develop what you were talking about, the self-containment, which is what ideally that's what we want. And the question is, how do we contain people who aren't always capable of that?
And one of the, in a sense, miracles really of our modern world is that certain psychotropic medications have been incredibly successful at calming down certain parts of the brain that storm, and they storm so intensely that the ego cannot figure out what to do. And then there's a kind of unpredictable venting of distress and agitation. And yet we're still in this difficult place. Can we mandate that somebody take medication? And our culture hasn't made a decision about that. And yet it's an important question.
Yeah. I've been thinking about this, and my thinking has changed some thanks to this conversation, because I've been a little polarized myself in my irate place that has felt like a collective refusal to deal with this problem adequately. I know some efforts are being made. And now I'm wondering if instead this is a problem of our shadow. Absolutely. A cultural and socioeconomic, mental health, all kinds of shadow. And that we might be on a collective journey toward something new, which says that people need to be contained, that people have a right to that, whether it's someone who's really down on their luck, who needs a leg up, a place to live, a living wage, all the way to someone who really is faced with inner chaos and doesn't have sufficient ego strength and needs firm, sensible, caring boundaries. That containment could be, I think I'm putting it out there as a new possibility.
And I think this vision is emerging or has emerged. I don't know that it's become a cultural expectation yet. I have friends that work at the VA, and they're working with homeless veterans, which is tragic. And when they identify as someone that needs housing, and there are systems in place to assist them, that comes with rules.
Mm-hmm.
And when there's enough resources, social workers will come and help them maintain the apartment just adequately, not harass the neighbors, show up for appointments so that they can be both monitored but also helped. And they need to have some other responsibilities. They're given some payments. They need to be able to manage and distribute them. These are basic expectations, which goes to what you're saying, is helping the psyche, perhaps a traumatized psyche, return to some reasonable cultural expectations and being provided assistance, help, kind, understanding, but clear.
Mm-hmm.
This is how it works. At least this is how it works in this culture at this time. There aren't 1,000 rules, but we're going to give you 10 rules, and we will help you understand and meet them. I mean, that's the best of all possible circumstances, but my friends often said a certain percentage of people just disappear, that it is still too much.
Mm-hmm.
They'll take to the streets.
So there's a whole range that would ideally be needed, from a little bit to a very great deal. But we could do better. We could do better.
And that is the voice of the Great Mother beautifully coming through you. These are our brethren. These are the children of humanity.
They are us.
They are us. And we extend concern and perhaps even extraordinary interventions so these tragedies, terrible tragedies, don't need to happen. When you were describing this terrible altercation on the subway, I was thinking about what you were saying about establishing containment, establishing order. I was really, for a moment, thinking about this as an archetypal enactment, that this is something that happened tragically in this microcosm on the subway that is also happening in the collective, that we as a culture are struggling mightily with, do we want the internet to be regulated very heavily?
Mm.
Do we want to digitalize all currency and then the government is constantly aware of the flow of resources? Will we tolerate that being regulated so that taxation laws are absolutely enforced? Do we want to change laws so that more things are looked at and more regulation is enacted? And can we predict that something good will come of that? These are big discussions. I mean, these are massively powerful discussions happening in the culture right now. And then we have this tragic archetypal enactment of dysregulation and this massive lunging at grabbing and subduing. This is something that's archetypal. And we as a culture, just as you said, are trying to figure out what to do. And terrible things are often happening as something is trying to emerge in consciousness.
And such a real tussling and battle between our American history of individual rights, of I have the right to do this or that or the other. And that there's been a real cultural history around that kind of self-determination and There used to be a flag with a snake on it that said, "Don't tread on me." I mean, we're pretty ferocious in our commitment to individualism, which is pretty different from individuation. And then there are the needs and requirements of community, of collective life, that we do live in a society. We all agreed that when there is a traffic light that's red, people have to stop, even if you don't feel like you should have to. We all do that. We stop on red, we go on green. And there are many other much more subtle and, as you say, very debatable issues around whether I get my way according to my values and my lights and rights, or whether there is an overarching communal value and need that it would be good to honor above my personal preference.
And all civilizations have created rules in order for civilization to exist. I mean, the Code of Hammurabi is, I think it was composed around 1750 BC. And if we look at the religious laws that inherited in many, many traditions, that they're ancient experiments at how to curtail or sublimate certain fierce natural instincts in order to be able to coexist, share resources, build to great communal decisions so that great civilizations can emerge. And just as you're saying, this tension between autonomy and interdependency, which, by the way, is the most primal fight in most marriages. I mean, that's what almost every marital therapy session comes down to, is this autonomy or kind of a collective decision-making surrender. And I don't know that either can totally rule, and for a couple, for instance, to continue to work together. Very similarly, on a societal level, there needs to be room for both. And the experiment of how much of one, how much of another, maybe there's a third thing we've never thought about, trying to figure out these various elements is really complicated, massively complicated. And we're screwing it up sometimes, terribly screwing it up. And sometimes we're doing amazing things as human beings in the civilization. But coming full circle, I hope that what we left people with who've been with us on this almost 2-hour journey is appreciating how complicated the symptom of homelessness is, and consequently how difficult it is to make a single intervention. And often people, when they see something they don't like, they'll say, well, why don't they just fill in the blank? Every cocktail party I'm at, talking to my relatives, well, they should just blah, blah, blah. It would be great.
If only
there was one solution that would manage an enormous problem. And of course, this is what our legislators struggle with. These complicated systems attempt to put in place. We experiment. Maybe they work. Maybe they're a mess. We have to go back to the drawing board. But I think what your call for Deb and mine is don't drop the ball. To not turn away from something that we haven't figured out how to solve yet, because it's just awful and excruciating and frightening and painful. But if we keep our human capacity for innovation focused on a problem, solutions will arise, because we've done that since, we woke up to ourselves. Before we go into a dream, I'd like to remind all of you that we have created our own online learning platform called Dream School. It's an experiment that continues to be alive and in motion. We have 12 modules, one a month, live Q&A sessions, opportunities to speak personally with us, online dream seminars that are exclusively for Dream School members, and a vibrant online community. This is an opportunity to really throw yourself into dream work, to take it apart and put it back together again and develop a sense of personal mastery. We hope to see you there.
This week's dreamer is a woman. She's 28 years old, and she does recruiting in her career. And here's her dream. In the dream, I was at my younger sister's house, and she woke me up in the middle of the night just crying and crying. Her whole face was just completely contorted with agony, but I had my earplugs in, so I couldn't hear her say what was wrong. Then my mom came in, and she was crying too. I took the earplugs out, but I still couldn't hear anything or understand them to know what was wrong. Everything was still muffled. It was absolutely heartbreaking to not be able to understand them or comfort them in their immense grief. And for context, she says there are no major life events or family issues going on at the time that she had the dream. And the main feelings in the dream were grief, distress, and agony. You know, what strikes me right away is how often people have dreams like this.
Mm-hmm.
As something really powerful erupts in the psyche in a dream, we wake up and we go, there's no drama in my life. I don't have relationship issues. I'm not in the midst of some kind of big career issue. I thought everything was going okay in my life. Where on earth could such a dream have come from?
So that's a wonderful example of the way that the dream maker autonomously decides there's something that we're not noticing, but is really significant. Perhaps in the outer world, because these are figures that are known to her, as well as in the inner world. But I'm going to start with just a subjective stance because we didn't get a lot of information about the living sister and the mother. But it starts where the dream ego is at her younger sister's house. So particularly with a short dream, each of these little descriptions of the dramatic action I think is significant. So to be in the younger sister's house suggests that this is not her familiar psychological terrain, that this is a part of her own psyche that she associates with her memories of her sister, perhaps ongoing information that she knows about the sister, but that the sister's context is primary, I would imagine, in this sister complex.
Yes. And I might even widen the lens to the family complex of around the feminine. So we don't know from what our dreamer has told us, what her family constellation was really like. Were there, brothers as well, for example? What about her dad, etc.? But what we do know is that this is a dream about sister and mother. So part of the family constellation in which she's at her younger sister's house. So she's staying somewhere younger with a younger sibling, and mom is also there. And our dream ego has earplugs in and cannot hear them. Also, what we notice is that the younger sister aspect of the dreamer wakes up the dream ego in the middle of the night. So this is something that is really in the unconscious, because the dream ego is asleep and it's nighttime, which is often part of the setting for when the unconscious comes alive. So here is something, as you said, Joseph, this is a subjective dream, meaning, just as Jung said, that all the parts of the dream, everyone in the dream, is a part of the dreamer.
So she gives us the setting, and then the next action is the sister has woken me up. But because of the other information, she didn't wake her up because of the sound. It's implied that some other action has occurred, some other sense, perhaps touch, perhaps turning the light on the room, but there was additional activity in the dream, and what I would imagine a certain agency in the younger sister, an insistence that even though you can't hear me, I am not going to let you sleep through this. So there's a definitive encounter in waking her up, and as Deb said, in the middle of the night, which suggests that she's deep in the unconscious. So the next thing that she becomes aware of, the dream ego, is that the younger sister is crying and crying and crying. Now, we can cry for many different reasons. We can make a lot of assumptions, but we're not quite sure here, and neither is the dream ego. She doesn't know what's wrong. We don't know if she's crying because of someone else's tragedy, her own tension. Is she crying because something overwhelming has happened? Maybe even something overwhelmingly good for all we know. But there's a mystery, and the general problem is that the ego is somehow impaired from receiving adequate information.
Yeah.
Which is just an interesting state to be in.
What I've been thinking about is, how often, in life, sometimes with a little kid who comes in and is upset and is just crying and crying and crying. And we want to say, okay, catch your breath, slow down. Tell me what's wrong, and he's going, we don't know. We're concerned. We're there, but are you hurt? Did you have a fight with a friend? What happened? And the demand in this dream similarly is a demand to elevate communication to a rational cognitive speech issue of tell me what's wrong, except our dream ego has earplugs in. And then even when she takes them out in the dream, everything is still muffled. So it implies that there is something going on beneath the threshold of cognition as represented by speech that our dream ego cannot hear.
Now, if we take that and think about earplugs, we don't know whether she normally sleeps with earplugs, but the way she says it, but I had my earplugs in, there's a sense of familiarity with it. So I'm going to make an assumption, which may or may not be correct, that this is a person who uses earplugs. That creates a whole tone in and of itself. What are the disruptive sounds in her current life or in the environment? Has she moved to a new place? Are there ambulance sirens going on all night? But there's a kind of stimulus in her environment that she is overly sensitive to or vulnerable to, and it's interfering with her ability to rest. So in order to be able to sleep, to go unconscious, she has to make a conscious decision to create barriers to stimulus. That may be an outer, but also an inner decision. I can't rest if I'm hearing all this fill in the blank. Mm-hmm. The too muchness of the environment has to be definitively shut down in order for her parasympathetic nervous system to kind of kick in, for her to recuperate.
I'm really circling around as we both are, I think, of the whole symbol of hearing. As opposed to seeing, for example. We often say things like, I see your point. And we often say things when someone's telling us something like, oh, okay, I hear you. In other words, I understand at a level underneath the physiological function of hearing or seeing. I understand. And what I am most curious about is that she says it's heartbreaking to not be able to understand or comfort them. Whereas if I go back to my example of a little child coming in, sobbing and unable to speak, the first thing we would probably do is say, put our arms around this little boy or little girl and say, hey, okay. I'm right here. It's okay. You're safe now. And give the child time to settle down a little bit and be able to say what happened. But our dream ego doesn't do that. She's heartbroken, but doesn't seem to have another way of connecting with them.
So it's an interesting setup that the dream maker has created. Unlike our waking life, the dream maker can reconfigure the ego to force it to have to focus on certain things and perhaps ignore other things. We all know that we might find ourselves in a dream where we would believe ridiculous things or even do strange things that somehow seem very reasonable in a dream world. We just accept these change of circumstances. So at first we think, oh, she's got these earplugs in. Why is the ego plugging her ears? What does she not want to hear? What does she not want to hear from the sister complex, the mother complex? Mm-hmm. What does she not want to hear in terms of her childhood experiences? Maybe. What is she trying to silence? But even when she takes the earplugs out, the dream maker still interferes with her ability to make sense of what's going on cognitively. So that's a really interesting situation. I'm also wondering whether she over relies on interpreting what people say or expecting people to explicitly explain things to her or around her. That there's an interesting conundrum, which people also have in the outer world. Terribly, sometimes people can have a virus, for instance, that attacks the auditory nerves, and late in life, they just suddenly can no longer hear or see, for that matter. It's a terrible tragedy. And it forces the other senses to become very, very attuned to compensate as much as can happen. So the dream maker has created this interesting environment where people you ostensibly care about are having very strong experiences, and you have to figure out how to relate to this without it being explained to you. Just as you were saying, Deb, much like being a mom.
Yeah. There's also, a whole concept around implicit knowledge versus explicit knowledge. And, we help children become verbal and be able to be explicit about communicating their internal states. But there are memories, experiences that are below the threshold of consciousness that are implicit. That's one of the things we do in therapy, is help people access some of these implicit memories, experiences, feelings, and make them more explicit. So, I'm kind of wondering here of what has been relegated to the realm of only explicit communication will do. versus what is implicit here of some kind of distress. And, siblings, sisters, and certainly mothers have a pretty major archetypal root, which means that they're bivalent symbols and images. There's a good mother, who comforts us and feeds us and does all kinds of things that we find pleasing and rewarding. And then we also all have a terrible mother who does the things that we don't find pleasing and rewarding. But that's archetypal, that somebody's personal mother could be in her terrible mode when, she won't let us stay out as late as we want or something like that. I'm wondering about the negative side of this archetype or archetypes, sister and mother, and how that may live in the dreamer.
So if the sister and the mother have very negative valences, blocking off the ears may be a way of trying to move forward, to not listen to the complexes all the time, to not take their bad guidance so that the ego can heroically come forward, which reminds me a little bit of Odysseus telling the sailors to stuff lamb's wool in their ears so they don't hear the siren song, but strap him to the mast because he does want to hear it, but he knows he'll be overwhelmed by it. So it's this interesting mythic moment of, do we put the lamb's wool in? Do we risk hearing what's going on? And if we really heard it, could we tolerate it? Would it be our doom to hear? So there's a wonderful mythic moment in this. Towards the end of the dream, I'm struck by the sentence where she says, it's heartbreaking to not be able to understand them or comfort them in their immense grief. There's something deeply sad about that sentence, because the dreamer believes, if I don't have words, if somebody doesn't explain to me explicitly what's going on, I'm not going to do anything.
Yeah.
Well, the body might want to respond. If mom and sister are sobbing and you are already intuiting grief, what's inhibiting her from going and holding, embracing, rubbing the back, looking in their faces, drying their tears, crying with them, getting a cool cloth for their face, some kind of a kinetic, sensate response as a way of connecting, even if the mind doesn't fully understand. So that's kind of the challenge that I think the dream maker is putting before her. Having impaired the hearing, and other senses kind of work their way up and become functional. Yeah.
I really like your example from Odysseus, the Odyssey, and the sailors putting lamb's wool in their ears so as not to hear the destructive sound of the sirens. Odysseus had himself strapped to the mast. He wanted to hear it. He knew he would succumb to it, so he asked to be immobilized so he could not fall prey to the sound of the sirens. But the sailors, his crew, have to stay at work. They got to keep on manning the oars or everybody will be in trouble. So the question is not whether you should or shouldn't hear, but is it in consciousness? Is it a choice? Is it a good thing to put lamb's wool in your ears so as not to hear the sirens and let the ship, sink or be captive? Or are you blocking out something that maybe you should hear? And that's a question that only our dreamer can answer. Where is the meaning in this? Is it a good practical survival solution, or does it fall into the realm of a kind of repression, or blocking out a defense of some sort?
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.